move forward with information, developmental stuff, of course. And I mentioned early on at the beginning of the semester that sometimes we're not going to really follow the textbook per se, because this is fill-in information. It's not information that I necessarily test you on, although there could be a question or two that comes from this. But for the most part, it's added material that you're not going to get from the textbook. And this is one of those days. And I'm going to jump ahead from where we were. We've talked about some basic areas, very basic areas. And now I want to jump way ahead into some of the nuts and bolts, some of the stuff that that your book probably is not going to take you deeply into. And we're going to start in the early stages of development age-wise. I'm not going to talk about the fetal period because there's a lot going on there, but that's more physical. So I want to really concentrate more in the area of brain development, and then it has an effect on physical, of course. So we're going to be talking about cognitive development today. And this is going to be in right after birth. So this is like the early formative years. So some of this is going to sound kind of detached somewhat from what you're used to, but it's really spot on. And let's just jump right into it, both feet. So cognitive development, how do we view it? There are 6 approaches used to determine cognitive development. The first is the behaviorist view, which is the mechanics of learning. It's behavior and experience. That's approach number 1. Then there's a psychometric view. So we have a behaviorist view, mechanics of learning, the behavior and experience, all these things that a child plugs in. And then the psychometric view, quantitative differences in abilities that make up intelligence. So we're really jumping far forward here. We haven't discussed that yet. Then we have the view from Jean Piaget, Piaget, pronounced Piaget, Jean. It's not Jean Piaget. He's Swiss, I think. I don't even remember. Jean Piaget. And his view is obviously called the Piagetian view. And he talks about changes in the described as stages. And he discusses the quality of cognitive function, how the mind structures its activities and adapts. He has this term he came up with, or really a word, schema, schema. That's a fancy sounding word. All it means is what's going on up here. What is your understanding of a given topic, of a given something, a physical function, walking or crawling, whatever it is you're doing? That's what he's talking about. How do you structure that? And then how do you change it? We'll get into that much later. Information processing, the 4th item on this list of the 6 approaches. Perception. Probably one of the most powerful words in psychology is perception. What does it deal with? It deals with your interpretation of things around you. And it can be emotional, it can be physical, it can be cognitive, whatever your perception is, how you understand things and your interpretation of that understanding. And within the information processing, perception, learning, I don't have to discuss that. You know what learning is. Memory, you know what memory is. And problem solving. So children learn to manipulate things early on when they're very, very, very young. Prior to crawling, they begin to learn problem solving. We don't sit down with them in a classroom and say, okay, little baby, hush crying so I can teach you how to problem solve. It's not the way it works, of course. It's through observation and just basically through instinctual things. The 5th thing on the list is cognitive neuroscience. That's really deep scientifically. It's the hardware of the central nervous system. Now, you're talking chemistry and electricity. You're talking about, I think we offer that class here at CU. Matter of fact, I think I'm going to be teaching it at some point, that cognitive neuroscience. I'm looking forward to that. And then the last thing on the list, social contextual, the effects of environmental aspects of learning, the role, for instance, that parents play, the role that other caregivers play, depending on your culture. You may come from a culture where everybody contributes to the development of a child, to the care of the child. Or in Western culture, us in the USA, where it's mom and dad, and in some cases mom, and in some cases dad. So depending on what your background is family-wise, you may or may not have two parents in a family. You may just have one, or it may be raised from your grandma, or whoever it is. That's your caregiver. Psychology likes to use the term caregiver rather than mommy and daddy, because it's not always mommy and daddy. So those are the cognitive, that's the 6 approaches used for us to make some determinations here. Now I could go through each one of these in great detail. I'm not going to. I'm gonna pick a few out just to give you an idea of what these things deal with. Let's begin with number 1, behaviorist approach, the one I mentioned first a moment ago. Some rudimentary ability to remember what's learned. Okay, there's a big discussion about when does real, true, sophisticated memory begin. The old belief system was that you don't have memory capability before the age of 2. Now there's a big argument almost about, wait a minute, maybe you do. But it's hard to determine that. Are we rehearsing something each time we ask a child to do a task that we taught them in the past? And through the rehearsal, are they just mimicking, or are they actually truly remembering how to do it? The second factor is maturation. Maturation is a limiting factor. What does maturation mean? It means where you are not emotionally mature. It's where you are physically and cognitively. That's maturation. So how rapidly am I putting it together up here? And then that can either enhance or limit how quickly I learn something, if I can even learn it at all. If you're normal, you will, but some of us learn quicker than others. That's what we're talking about here. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Hopefully you remember that from Intro to Psych. Classical conditioning is basically repetition. That's the Pavlov dog thing. It's an association, kind of a learning. Bing, hear a bell, makes me hungry. That's the dog thing that Pavlov did. Pretty in-depth experiments. That's the nuts and bolts of it. Classical conditioning, basic learning, that's what that means. As opposed to operant conditioning, a higher level of learning based on reinforcement and punishment, and based on your decisions and the consequences of your decision. So a more sophisticated learning, a higher level of learning. It's sometimes called Skinnerian learning. B.F. Skinner did a lot of work in this area. So classical conditioning, operant conditioning, all part of the developmental process. Infant memory and infantile amnesia. What is that address? Oh my gosh. Infantile amnesia. We're dealing with infant memory here. Infantile amnesia, an inability to remember events or experiences before the age of 2. So here's a reinforcement of what's being discussed in higher circles right now. Are they actually, it doesn't mean there's something wrong, by the way. Let me clear that up really quickly. Infantile amnesia doesn't mean, oh no, his brain's messed up. No, it means they can't remember anything because the part of your brain hasn't developed yet where memory is stored. There are several parts in your brain where memory is placed, and those areas aren't fully developed yet before the age of 2. So, hey, that's the argument for age of 2, as opposed to the argument against, which says, yeah, there's some kind of rudimentary memory taking place. Study's still going on. So brain development, part of infant memory, memory associated with the ability to talk. This is a big advance because you're learning words and then you learn you repeat them, you remember them, memory, and you know what they mean, starting around 2. And then the last one, and this is not really an approach per se, it's an explanation of what's going on. New research dealing with retention time. The idea is that retention time in new memory, new little ones, little kiddies, new retention time may be shorter, but the memory itself may be equivalent to the same as older children. And then the last thing in this particular section, and I just mentioned it a moment ago, rehearsal. Babies, the idea, the postulate is that babies sometimes may remember if rehearsed. There are a lot of words, may, remember, sometimes. So the jury's still out on that bad boy. Let me jump quickly from there. I'm going to pick another one out. There's actually, I'm going to mention Piaget, and I'm going to slam on the brakes after that. The Piagetian approach, primarily associated with sensory memory stage of his theory. What does that mean? Well, if you don't know Piaget's theory, read it in the textbook because I don't have time to cover it today. And within his theory, there's a sensory motor portion of it talking about how you are physically functioning and remember how to do that. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the approach that we're discussing here, and there's 6 substages of that. And I'm not going to try to bore you to death with all those substages because we're talking about birth to approximately a month old. That's a sensory motor. Exercise some control over reflexes. I'm just giving you a quick rundown. Jump from 1st to 3rd, for example, 4 to about 8 months. New interest in manipulation of objects. In other words, you're thinking about a little baby laying in its crib, playing with a rattle for the first time, dropping it and hitting themselves in the face. And they're trying to learn how all this works. Okay? So that's basically a quick rundown of some of the ideas of cognitive development. There's much, much more to it than that. But we don't really have time for me to cover all that in depth. And it's in the text, and you'll be reading about it. But I'd just like to get you kind of acclimated to it. So with that in mind, we will shut this thing down for the day, and I'll be back with you a couple times this week. All right, take care.